Like a pig.
Okay, so we are on chapter 18. We're getting close to the home stretch there, and still on pain, but now moving to chronic pain. So let me pray, and we'll do it to it. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks that we might gather in person and online, share time, share the knowledge and wisdom of this chapter, share your goodness and your grace. Lead us, Lord, into discussions that are good, that honor you, and that bless us. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Okay. So the concept of chronic pain, we've in some ways kind of touched on already before. It's sort of folded into whenever we've talked about pain. As a matter of fact, last week we spent a little bit of time talking about, personal experiences about chronic pain, various difficulties or maladies or weaknesses that we have or have had. And this one has kind of a lengthy introductory story. This is one of the longer personal stories that I can remember from these chapters. Normally they're just kind of like the first little section, and this one was at least two. Mainly because of just how significant this whole scenario was and how it played out. So, who wants to get us started then? Maybe just kind of recap a little bit, just maybe the beginning part of the story. The story itself is so long, we can have a couple of people chip in, but who can sort of set the stage about what this first anecdote is about?
Is it Rahama?
I'm assuming it's Rahama.
Came into his office and she seemed very timid, and he gave her time to get relaxed and get talking about. She had very badly scarred face,
Mm-hmm.
and he said he recognized it was the treatment by medicine men.
Right.
Said that this kind of thing could happen after an infection or with no identifiable cause. And he asked about, she was very thin, and he asked about that, and she said, well, she didn't dare chew.
Oof.
So she was on a liquid diet.
Yes.
Can't imagine. And that the pain hit many times a day. And he, after talking to her for a while, decided that the only way he could work with her was a nerve block.
Yeah.
And that represented her only hope.
Right. And what he winds up doing in severing nerves is obviously sort of an extreme a treatment, kind of a treatment of last resort.
And he said he wasn't trained for this kind
Yeah,
of
that's kind of the thing.
Scary.
Yeah. How many times would a referral be made to a specialist? But now you're talking about you're it. And he'd never even done the procedure before. He'd read a couple of books and he try to do a little research in advance.
Said he had done one years before, and it didn't really explain whether it was in a lab or how he happened to do this similar, but anyway,
Yeah.
he had done something like it. And he knew that he was going to have to cut 2 nerves because they couldn't decide which one it was that was affecting her face.
Yeah.
And just do it and hope.
Right. So not being any good with my French pronunciation, he writes tic douloureux, and it's a neuralgia of the face in its most severe form. He describes it. So basically, something would set off this terrible, painful tremor in her face, and it could be almost anything. And
she made an effort not even to smile.
Right. So their whole life, the life of the entire family became centered around her pain. What were some of the ways that their lives were impacted?
The chickens couldn't be.
Yeah, chickens couldn't even come inside.
Kids couldn't play.
Kids couldn't play. You know, everyone was very quiet all the time. She barely spoke, and it sounds like she barely moved. And not only was she not eating solid food, did you catch what else about the liquid?
Yeah, they pulled all her teeth on one side, so she just had liquid to avoid chewing.
Right, and temperature. It wasn't like not even hot and cold, like just basically tepid, I don't know, soup or something constantly. So, you know, so much of our health can be impacted by our nutrition. And to imagine, you know, you're already facing physical pain, but then what does that got to do to the rest of her body? That what she can eat is so incredibly limited.
Her health must have.
It must have affected all sorts of stuff with her health. I mean, she's described as being kind of emaciated and very drawn, and I'm sure she has to be physically weak, tired all the time. Now, I will say,
When she had her teeth pulled.
right, the teeth pulled, in some sort of hope. Like if it was some kind of an infection or an abscess or whatever, just go ahead and pull them with any hope that it would help. So a couple of things on this. I read this story with interest, and obviously, you know, a lot of sadness of how miserable that must have been. I did not initially connect in my mind, at least. This is not the scenario I would have considered as chronic pain. Now, was I the only one? When I think of chronic pain, I think of constant pain, not necessarily a chronic condition that happens repeatedly. I think of constant.
Okay.
And that's just, you know, how it was in my head. I'm not disputing this is not a chronic pain, but it's almost like something that's always there. And maybe you don't pay as much attention to it at other times, or maybe it gets worse. It's in some moments, but just that sense of the unrelenting nature of hurt. At least that's what's in my mind when I think of the word chronic pain. And so this is just like this is a broadening of that definition, that her condition was chronic, it was terribly painful, and really there didn't seem to be anything that you could do to stop it. All they could do was barely manage it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly consider that a chronic condition. Her life was so restricted 24 hours a day in order to avoid that intense pain. She couldn't do anything.
Sure. Yeah, no, the condition was absolutely chronic. I wasn't initially thinking, though, about the pain being chronic because I sort of associate it with constant pain.
Well, it's constant if you didn't do anything.
Most likely, yeah. You know, if she smiled all day, it would hurt all day. And so it was just sort of to me, it was a little bit unexpected, but it was an interesting expansion in thinking about it. There's all sorts of stuff that doesn't have to hurt, you know, immediately or terribly, but the fact that it could be there at any moment and it never goes away.
Her fear of pain was chronic, for sure.
100%. I mean, their entire lives were, not just hers, but her family was centered around her pain.
Walking on eggshells.
Now, he will shift a little later on into this concept of pain management. And we've all probably now experienced some sort of, you know, medical overlap with the field of pain management, which I don't think they talked very much about 20 years ago. Or maybe if they did, it was seen as kind of a relatively new specialty. You know, pain management was something that you just did within a condition, but to have an actual specialty, I think is relatively new. But that's basically what she and her family were doing in their own way. That was all pain management techniques of mostly just trying to avoid what was triggering it, but to the best of their ability, they were trying to mitigate this constant pain. Even like the local medicine man treatments or the pulling of the teeth, basically pain management techniques, at least the best that they could come up with. Anybody have anything chronic that they have had to make adjustments to? Physical adjustments?
My back,
Okay.
Me.
because it's the same kind of thing. I had to change my activities not to flare up the back pain.
Okay. And so stuff that you would have done, you don't, or stuff that you used to do, you have to do it differently?
Yes.
Mary Lou, your knee?
Knee. Inherited arthritis, and when you get up, you watch to see what's going to happen before you move.
Okay. Okay.
And then get going.
Okay. So you have to think through your motions and be prepared and be kind of careful in advance. Sure. I've got a shoulder impingement that's been bothering me for months, and it's gotten better as I've worked on some self-treatment because I'm trying to avoid surgery because I've been told that the recovery time is like 6 months. And one of the things, I got new pillows, and that helped a lot because my sleep was hurting me. I'm a side sleeper, and that might have been where some of it started. But just better, more pillows allowed me to change my posture. But even still, though it's better than it was, I have to be real careful about how I sleep, where I put my arm, motions that I make, like something really easy, like I'm going to reach behind me or toss something I can't do because it's going to hurt. The worst was, my stories recently about working on the electrical problems here. Because of the nature of a couple of these circuits, I've had to wire a few things hot, which I don't mind doing. But one of them, some of the circuits were sort of crossed, and I got a jolt out of a ground line, which you shouldn't really ever be worried about. And 110 is it kind of surprises you, but it's not gonna kill you. But I had a little bit of a jolt. Well, there's an involuntary reflex with and it's my bad arm, and man, did that hurt. I had to kind of stop for 5 minutes and let it calm back down. And it wasn't the pain of the shock, it was the shock caused my arm to move, which caused the pain in my shoulder, and then I was done for a few minutes. But I've had to kind of learn a different way of doing things, knowing that it's better to avoid it and not, kind of tempt fate. So I think about this poor lady and the burden her family carried, and then the burden she must have carried knowing that her whole family was impacted. All right, so basically radical surgery, even though it wasn't maybe, radical in its complexity, it was radical in its outcome. You cut a nerve and it's gone, it's done.
Yeah, considering the circumstance that he had no education in this area, certainly, and no experience, I think that operation was miraculous.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think having the courage to go in and try to do it, I'm so inspired by that. This was the most interesting chapter to me that we've read so far.
Wow.
Because digressing a little, on the subject of pain management,
yeah,
there's nothing that could have been done in that instance using the present techniques of pain management that would have alleviated her condition.
Probably not.
And going back into my history, and I may have recited this before, many years ago, it seems like many years, I had stenosis in both legs, unbearable. And I went to a surgeon who specialized in stenosis, back stenosis. And he did a wonderful job. I walked out of the hospital with absolutely no pain. And the years since then have been pain-free. And I can't think of anything, any pain management practice that would have given me the relief that that surgery did.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of pain management. I think it avoids surgery. And that seems to be its objective.
Yeah.
Well, medicine treats the symptoms, it doesn't treat the cause.
Yes.
And Tom's doctor treated the cause.
Well, and this is, when you, especially when you know firsthand, not just the pain, but the alleviation through that particular treatment or intervention. The real sympathy for this woman and her story. There was courage on Dr. Brand's part to basically do something that he probably wouldn't have any business doing in a different circumstance. But that courage, I think, was grounded and motivated from his compassion. This woman was 100% desperate, which is why, even though he laid out in as dire terms as possible what a bad idea this was, they're like, yep, do it. Yep, right. Can you do it right now? It really just underscores how miserable that life must have been.
All their lives.
All of them.
Yeah, the whole family.
Again, the whole family impacted. And as someone who never wants to be a burden on the people that I care about, knowing that everyone else is miserable because of me is going to make my pain worse. And so they just all said, it was worth it. It was worth it. So to toss in kind of a not personal anecdote, one of the many reasons I have such great respect for my father-in-law is not just his technical acumen as a surgeon, and he's a very accomplished cardiothoracic surgeon, but surgeons kind of keep track, sort of like sports teams, wins and losses, your outcomes, it makes a difference. And his were never particularly good. But there's a reason for it, because he was the guy who would give people a shot that nobody else would. When people were poor surgical risks, as long as they were okay with it, he would do it. And so he had, maybe a higher percentage of unsuccessful outcomes than his colleagues, but because his colleagues would say, no, I don't like your history. I don't like what your statistics look like right now. I don't like the odds. So I'm just not going to do surgery. The surgery was that person's only alternative. It was a risky surgery or death. My father-in-law wanted to be the guy to give them that chance. And I just always respected that so much, that, how many lives were saved because he gave them a chance that other people would not have.
Yeah, from what you said, he wasn't conscious or concerned, I should say, about his batting average.
Right. That was always very secondary. Obviously everybody wants to not only do a good job, but you want your outcomes to be good, because not only does it look good for you, but you want your patients to survive. You want more people to be well than fewer, but kind of going into it, whether it was the patient's age or whether it was the other problems that they had or the complexity of the surgery, you would rather make a very significant risk, but there's no alternative. And that's kind of what I saw here, is that it was Dr. Brand's compassion that said that's worth the risk. and we get kind of a lengthy description of the complexity of this particular surgery and the, the cotton thread width bundles of nerves that he, untangling them and yeah. Anyone get a little twinge when he was like touching the nerve and she was saying, "Yep, you're touching my eye." Like, ugh.
Yeah, yeah.
And that his moment of, I would almost say panic, that he had during doing this, and then recovered from it.
Yes. Yeah. So the outcome, was finally able to pare it down to 2 nerves. And so, sure, if he knew exactly which one, then he could just do that one, but there was no way to know. So she was going to have some numbness that she wouldn't have had otherwise, but a trade-off that this family seems overjoyed to have made. And if you could just imagine, after all of that time, all of the treatments, all the change in life and avoidance and pain and suffering and sorrow from everybody, to finally have kind of a normal life again.
I think he made a really interesting contrast right at that point. He was talking about holding those 2 nerves in his hands.
Yeah.
And he says, yeah, these nerves containing hundreds of axons, serving thousands of nerve endings, were domineering an entire family. Meanwhile, nerves just like them were steadying my hands and letting me know exactly how much force to apply to my instruments.
You know what? I almost glossed over that, but that's a really great little passage.
Yeah, I mean, same nerves, depending on the situation, are doing opposite things, either causing terrible destruction or causing him to have the exact touch he needed to do this surgery.
Yeah.
And on that note, I need to go.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah, and it just this kind of a sweet little vignette at the end about purposefully smiling again to see if it would work and if it would hurt, and I mean, this is a woman who got her life back. This is a whole family.
Yeah.
They got all of their lives back.
Her husband was.
Yeah, that was just fantastic. So he makes this very, again, very, very, very stark anecdote, and then kind of pulls us into a transition and thinking about its application on a more, human interactive level and the level of the church as a whole and sort of spiritual metaphors. So he seems to have a little more use for pain management than say Tom did, but even that seems to be, more of, very small, simple things. I'm gonna have to try that one about the stroking your skin with the bristle brush, or walking on the walking on the rocks when your back hurts. I might have to try one of those at some point. But he moves into this whole section actually has a title, Compassion Fatigue. And I think that's what a lot of this chapter winds up being about, is about, it's sort of the overwhelming,
Open the door. Bye-bye.
sort of the overwhelming nature of suffering within a system, church, a family, the world. So what are some ways that he's applying the medical concept or biological concept of chronic pain to sort of a more spiritual realm?
He was talking about when there were disasters,
Like natural disasters.
people respond to that and give freely,
Yeah.
but then after a while, it doesn't go away completely, but people lose interest.
Right. Right. So let's say there's a, terrible typhoon or an earthquake or something like that in an impoverished part of the world. It's insult to injury. Maybe their infrastructure was already shaky. Maybe the lifestyles there were already, very difficult. And then something else dramatic happens and it's a real calamity. And so people respond very generously. There's money, there's support, there's effort, there's energy to respond to kind of an immediate and acute crisis. But then what happens once the crisis has sort of passed its climax and begins to filter down?
The support goes away.
The support goes away. Now, why? There's a couple of reasons, I think, at least, if not more. What are some of the reasons the support goes away?
Well, one reason might be another crisis
Yeah,
arises.
right.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, there's another crisis that is getting attention or
Yes.
or the news or whatever. And so that can definitely be part of what else?
Well, it becomes old hat. You're tired of talking about it or thinking about it.
Sure. When dealing with problems beyond the scope of an obvious or a quick fix, or sometimes any fix, at some point, doesn't it just kind of wear you out? So I had a lot of mixed feelings in this section. And I want to throw out a couple of things and just kind of see, and maybe it's just me. And I've done some overseas work, and I certainly want us as a congregation responsive to the needs of others, even when they're, far away, or whatever that circumstance might be. And this is a congregation that's always been generous in that regard. Maybe
I have a situation in that regard. Perhaps about 20 years ago, there was a wide appeal to contribute money to, I don't know whether it was Zimbabwe or one of the countries over there, I've forgotten. So following the trend, I signed up for a monthly contribution to this charity. And through the years, it's just become part of my giving. I don't even think about it. I get an annual report of the work that was done, and that's it. But I don't have a feel for that situation anymore. It's just part of my life, and I don't think about it.
Yeah. What kind of, some of these mixed feelings that I have sort of involve, to go back to his own biological discussions on pain and how the body responds to it. When I think of chronic pain, again, I'm kind of thinking of constants. Your own mind sort of reclassifies pain that doesn't go away. It's sort of like when we've had earlier chapters about sensation and touch, like your body stops feeling the clothing that you're wearing because it'd be like sensory overload. At some point, your brain starts saying, okay, I know what that is, and I'm going to move on to something else because, I'm wired to respond to new changes, not to things that are already sort of established. In the same way that we don't see our noses unless we try, and then we can, but our brain just kind of erases them, right? That again, this is as someone who I've experienced years of constant pain in a variety of ways. to some degree, you just kind of live with it. And it doesn't seem, I'm not going to say it doesn't seem as bad, but it doesn't seem as central, at least in some circumstances. Clearly, the story about the woman, how can it not be central, and everything around her life revolves around that. But there's a lot of chronic pain that you just don't even pay attention to anymore, because you've sort of learned either to expect it or what to do about it, or you just kind of stop paying attention. Like, it is what it is. And I start to wonder about the scope of suffering worldwide, what we can actually do and what we should do. I don't want to dismiss his concerns that we need to be responsive and that we ought to be empathetic with the suffering from around the world, just because they're not directly connected to us. We're connected by the body of Christ. But at the same point, you could be overwhelmed by the amount of suffering in a single day just in your city. Now multiply that by 1 billion. How can you actually take anything seriously if you have to take everything seriously? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
By temperament, I kind of don't care for hyperbole. And I'm not suggesting that that I'm right. I'm just saying it's just the way I think. And it's unique to me. This is not the way to do it. I'm just saying this is how I think. So I actually get a little twitchy when I hear people mention somewhat reflexively about, oh, I read this story about something that happened somewhere else, and my heart broke, or I cried about something. Like, did you really cry? I mean, like a physical tear, or are you just sort of saying that because you mean that's a sad situation and an appropriate human response is sorrow? Because sometimes it feels very disingenuous. And I know that I wasn't crying, even though I was sad to hear about something tragic. Don't we kind of have to not take everything as deeply and as seriously as everything?
There are so many sad situations throughout the world. There isn't a country that doesn't have issues,
Sure.
big issues. You can't address them all. You almost have to say, gee, that's too bad. It's just, you're overwhelmed
Yeah,
with the need that exists.
I don't want to advocate anything that sounds like callousness, but at the same time, I really understand, like this compassion fatigue that he's mentioning. You can respond to a crisis, like an international crisis, but that doesn't necessarily fix the long-term infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily fix their long-term, economic outlook, or it doesn't necessarily have anything at all to do with a particular family who lives in that country who is suffering their own unique difficulties, and there's maybe nothing you can do about it. And so after addressing the emergent situation, maybe there's even a practical element of we can't do everything at all times. And so maybe figuring out the ways that we can use the resources entrusted to us, that the strong genuinely should be helping the weak. But how do you do that in a way that is actually effective and sustainable? Because you can't do it everywhere all the time. But how do you do it in such a way that can be maintained without becoming shut off and calloused? And that's why I read this chapter, and I was kind of, again, very conflicted. What do you do with this? In a practical sense, what do you do with this? Whether it's a personal experience of chronic pain, or I'm thinking of a couple of other people who have very difficult personal circumstances. Say, dealing with a special needs child, or a disabled spouse, And from the outside, it looks like an overwhelming and impossible problem. I could never do that, or I would never want to, whatever. But at some point, each of those people, it's no longer an emergency. It's their life, you know? And that's not to say emergencies can't happen. And then the way the body can then kind of converge and help during a time of crisis. But the kind of ongoing nature of it maybe doesn't change all that much because it's not an emergency any longer. You know, your special needs child is the special needs child potentially forever. It's no longer the moment of. It's no longer, you know, a crisis to be addressed right then or to seek help right then. It's just, well, yeah, my life is complicated in its own way. And I see that as sort of connected to this chronic pain where to some degree you kind of live with it. Obviously in extreme cases you can't, sort of like the woman in the beginning of the chapter. Something had to give or else she probably would have lost her mind. But isn't there a lot of chronic pain that doesn't quite reach that threshold? That's difficult. It changes your life negatively, but you do sort of adjust. And
You know, Father David, when you talk about the child that, and I think about, it makes me think about all the parents or some of the parents that I've known that say what a blessing it is to have had a child like that.
Yeah.
And it also makes me think about the physical pain that they must make the adjustments just like you do. You ask, do you do things differently because of your physical pain? Yes, you do. And that's what they do with their lives. They don't choose to live their life like you or I do because we think that's overwhelming to have to take care of a child like that. And they just choose to have that be their life. Yeah. I have a sister-in-law that has a granddaughter that was disabled, and her father, the mother couldn't handle it and left, but the father took that child and raised her and always took her, he was a chef, and always took her to his job, and always a lot of the times he paid her out of his wages for the work that she did to assist him.
Yeah.
He passed away of cancer, and that young lady, she had the sweetest personality. That young lady took over being a chef in a restaurant. She lives with an aunt because she can't live on her own. But I've always just been so inspired by her and him for what he did for that girl and how her life has been so much better in the contributions that she's making to the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think of Carrie Baker.
Carrie Baker. You know,
yes.
When Carrie was born, and I wasn't there because, you know, she's, you know, not that much younger than me. You know, that the sorrow and the hardship on the family about a Down syndrome birth and the sense of loss. You know, we're not going to have the sort of family we thought we were going to have. She's not going to have the sort of future we thought she might have had, or whatever it might be. Carrie Baker is such a precious person, and even though there was loss and suffering, and that gets transformed almost by the person she does become. But even that doesn't denigrate hardships that continually happen, but it just sort of changes. It's not an emergency. Oh my gosh, you know, she's got this problem. Well, no, I mean, her life is different than it would have been otherwise, but there's a joy in it. There's a great peace in it. And I mean, some really, really remarkably amazing things. And I don't know, again, I feel very conflicted about respecting and wanting that kind of softness and openness to compassion to help, but at the same time, wondering about the practicalities of it, not just in the sense of could I do it, but even should I do it, and what does this really look like? He makes this transition near the end of the section, and it's one that I really like. I just don't know where it fits, where he talks about his Aunt Eunice in England and how she kept a little book and she would just visit these ladies every month, and she'd bring food or money or whatever. And so he saw that as this, and this is considered a classical Christian virtue, constancy. And it's not a real popular one because it doesn't seem very flashy, but constancy, like this dependability and not, continuing despite fatigue and doing the right thing, basically. And so she would just visit these little ladies, and I loved that. And to me, it kind of brought it back to that practical sense. But this was not a woman who was trying to visit every sick person in the city or throughout the world, but she felt a calling maybe to this group, but she would do it long term.
When I read that, I was thinking the same. You do what you can do, and when things need to change, you make little changes in it, but you give what you can give and have to be content with that.
And I don't know if it's my own sense of insecurity or guilt feelings or whatever, but you hear these pleas for help or compassion, like, but there is really something quite precious in maybe how God has built us to respond less to the abstract and more to the neighbor placed in your life, and to do so on an ongoing basis. The humanity lived for millennia having no idea what was going on across the world. And now we're inundated. But whether we do know or don't know, that shouldn't preclude our responsibility to act as the Good Samaritan acted when the opportunity arises. But just parsing that into how and when and who, and again, I like this, and I wonder if this is not how God has built the world and all of us, that it's less about the flashy things, it's less about the grand moments and gestures, and maybe more about the small acts of kindness and charity, the consistent, humble, almost overlooked care and compassion that maybe results in more than the big gesture towards a specific event. I don't know. Anybody else on that?
I would say that that's probably most people's everyday struggle, because the other side of it is when you do for people, how long do you do and what do you do that doesn't enable them?
Yeah.
And this, it appeared that this lady that she was helping functioned at the best level she could, but this was a way to just make her life a little bit better. And that's what kind of stood out to me, because I struggle with the portion of not enabling.
Sure.
Yep.
With people, and tough love is tough. It's tough on the person that has to function under it, as well as I'm sure it's tough on the person who is trying to get you to be a total, well, or what's the word I want, be of assistance on a consistent basis. I
Yeah.
remember when I was secretary at the church in California, that was one of the decisions that the deacons and the boards said to me is when people come in and ask for handouts, talk with them a little bit about their circumstances as well as their belief systems, ministering to them to try to find out if they go church to church
Yeah.
before you assist them. And that's always stayed with me with life. And I struggle with how much money our government gives to foreign aid to other governments. And I know that we need to do that when there's so many people in our country that needs the assistance. And I mean, you can go on and on with it.
Yeah. It is, this is, because it's real life and it's real humanity, I think by definition, it becomes more art than science. You know, because people are not widgets and we're not numbers, and circumstances are not, you know, reducible to zeros and ones. That means there's always going to be an unknown factor. There's always going to be a margin there. There's always going to be an unknowable space of, you know, trying to faithfully do our best, rather than a formula that has all of the answers. Now, this chapter, to me, kind of ended in a interesting spot. It's not that it's unrelated, but I wasn't quite expecting the twist at the end and turning into something else. But I really liked it. I really liked this last sort of body spirit metaphor, and it's one that I have some particular familiarity with. What does he tell us about joints?
Just me.
The synovial fluid. So what's so significant about the synovial fluid?
It's what keeps the bone, I'm not sure what it is, the joint, whatever. it
Yeah,
is, from rubbing on each other.
Right.
And wearing out.
That's right. So optimally, the actual, you know, physical components of the joint, the bone and the ligament, are not really touching each other. They're not really rubbing up against each other. There's always a cushion in between, and that's the fluid. And what seems so amazing about the process of the fluid?
It's added when it needs lubrication.
Yeah, it like on demand and pressurized. That was the other kind of fun.
Yeah.
And these engineers thought that was a concept that had just recently been invented, and our bodies have been doing it all along. And it's only as we age that fluid is less able to perform that function. And so, you know, there's that, he mentions the rheumatoid arthritis where the body actually starts attacking itself, but osteoarthritis is basically as that fluid decreases and the friction becomes higher, and that whole concept of the stuff that really shouldn't ever be rubbing up against each other starts rubbing up against each other. And there's pain, and there's damage, which leads to more pain, and so on and so forth. And he, you know, gives us a quick little medical education on this and the wonders of our body, but then what's his little twist ending of a spiritual application? I thought this was pretty fun.
People working together and rubbing each other the
People
wrong
working
way.
together and rubbing them, who rub each other the wrong way. So if you know that that relationship might be like a joint, what should that relationship have? So it needs some synovial fluid. What's the spiritual equivalent of a joint's lubrication? and I kind of liked that, that sort of preemptive thinking, kind of, you know, Mary Lou, when you're talking about with your knee, you have to sort of think through what you're going to do in advance. If you sort of know, well, that person rubs me the wrong way, or this situation, I'm going to go into a committee meeting, or I'm going to go into this circumstance or whatever, and I'm going to be on edge, and there could be sparks. Well, think ahead, what might lubricate that, especially within the life of the body of Christ?
Prayer.
And just that ability to pray in advance and pray through a circumstance. Sometimes an intermediary. You ever have know somebody who's just good at that? They're good at diffusing a situation, and they're good at helping two people communicate better. You know, one of the kind of interesting things that you can do at some point is take Paul's body metaphor and run it into the ground. So, you know, some are hands and some are feet and some are eyes and some are ears. Well, then you just start picking other body parts and see, is there a spiritual metaphor within the life of a congregation or the church universal? Do some people operate like skin? Do some people operate like a liver? You know, what does the liver do? It purifies the system, you know, so it excretes the toxins. Do you know people who do that, who have that function? You know, some people are like the mouth, and maybe there's a speaking element or taking stuff in. Could somebody be like the synovial fluid? And if you kind of know that there's going to be a potential there, well, maybe there's somebody else who can be that cushion. Maybe in the prayer, would the Holy Spirit bring a cushion between us, because I know this is going to be a joint where there's going to be some rubbing up against each other. But just having that sense of awareness and purposefulness, acknowledging that when things rub, they create friction. Friction can cause heat and pain. What could be done to maybe mitigate that? I wasn't expecting that change of direction, but I thought it kind of worked, and it was a pretty neat little thought.
I thought it was a great thought and very humbling. And the great example that I really came to the foreground for me was last year with the board and the communication, and Tony being the minister, and we used him to communicate to the side that was always fighting.
Yeah.
To bridge that gap of communication, and accomplished it. And I always felt that was God's purpose of the configuration of the board at that time. And when that was accomplished, it wasn't necessary anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, the body fulfilled its role. Yeah. All right, well, what else? Anything? Chronic pain. I'm not a big fan, but it happens. Okay, so we are, I think, 5 chapters from the end. And so by my very rough count, this will take us past Easter, but not far. So I think what we'll do, we will we'll just be meeting on a regular Wednesday basis. As long as you guys are all right with it, I'm perfectly fine with the Wednesday of Holy Week. And then the Wednesday of Easter week, we can see if we want to do that or not, if we're going to take the time off. If we do continue, I may wind up doing everybody on Zoom and not having an in-person just for Easter week. We'll see when we get a little bit closer. But then, you know, again, by my count, we'll go just a couple of weeks past Easter, and then we'll probably take a little bit of a break, and then have the chance to do something different. Sound good? All right. Well, thank you everybody very much. And I will see you guys next time.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Father David.